welcome to the first of its kind for the Carter School panel discussion entitled Gumbo Diplomacy, How Food is Used to Win Friends and Influence People. Just to let you know that this event is a collaboration between the Carter School and Eats Meets West. My name is Hassana Thomas. I'm the founder and president of Entertainment Television Productions. It's a nonprofit organization based here in the DMV. I'm also the visionary and producer of Eats Meets West. So Eats Meets West is a once-a-month live in-person foodie event that brings together dynamic, engaging, well-traveled individuals with a compassionate world perspective to our table, our platform, to engage in a series of uniquely curated discussions centering around food, culture, and its complexities and creativity, around nostalgia and experiences that ends in a tasting, like a food sampling of delectable international delights. Unfortunately, we're virtual, so you won't have any of that today, but we'll be happening in the future. So if you're not already plugged into the Carter School's calendar of events, be sure to get plugged in for future iterations of Eats Meets West. So food is a powerful medium that transcends boundaries and brings people together. Before I introduce our marvelous lineup of panelists, let me first give credit where credit's due and explain how we came up with the title for this panel discussion. The term gumbo diplomacy, a metaphorical term, was first used by United States UN Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield when accepting President Biden's nomination to become the U.S. Ambassador for the United Nations, and that was back in November of 2020. She went on to describe her experiences living overseas and hosting guests in her home, and that when she really wanted them to enjoy the meal, she would cook it, and that it was her gumbo that went over big with her guests. She said that it causes people to relax. You're sitting around talking about food. You've had this really important conversation about human rights, and now you're having a conversation about what you put in your gumbo and what a roux actually is. So we're here today to talk about the role and power of food being used as a diplomatic tool to create bonds and promote understanding and build bridges. Today we have four wonderful panelists who are consummate professionals in their own right, and you can read their full bio on Carter School's Peace Week webpage. So for now, I'll just briefly introduce each of them so we can kind of get this discussion going. I'll begin with Dr. Joanna Mendelsohn Foreman, adjunct professor at American University's School of International Service, and she's also the creator of the Conflict Cuisine Project. It's a course that she teaches there. We also have Melvin P. Foote, founder and president of the Constituency for Africa, and I'm pretty sure Mel has visited just about every country in Africa, so I know he's had some good food. We have Matthew Wendell, he's the Assistant Chief of Protocol and General Manager of the Blair House, also author of Recipes from the President's Ranch. Prior to his current role at the Blair House, Matthew served President George W. Bush and the First Family as their personal chef for 8 years. And joining us later on will be our own Dean of the Carter School, Dean Alpaslan Ozodurm, or as the people love to call him, Dean Alp. And so Dean Alp, actually, he's of Turkish heritage, which is famously known for its food traditions. And I'm sure he can talk for hours about the alchemy of Turkish coffee, right? And certainly last but not least, of course, is our moderator of the panel. I'm not moderating. We have Mercedes Alsop. She's actually on staff here at the Carter School as executive assistant to the dean. As a former U.S. Marine, Mercedes has done a good bit of traveling herself. So I'll leave it there. So I just want to thank everybody, thank our panelists, and I'm going to hand it over to you now, Mercedes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassana, and welcome everybody. Welcome all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the incredible world of gumbo diplomacy, right? So you might be wondering, what does gumbo have to do with diplomacy, right? Probably the question that everyone is asking at this point. Well, I have personally experienced the impact of food diplomacy as a Marine, during my travels, especially specifically in the Middle East. We know that sharing a meal with a foreign counterpart can open a lot of doors for, fruitful dialogue, and it also establishes rapport and ultimately it can have an impact on negotiations and agreements. But today we have a very diverse group of experts who has a passion for this type of diplomacy, and they're getting ready to shed some light on the fascinating world of food and the role it plays in international relations, diplomacy, and post-conflict reconstruction. I'd actually like to start with Johanna, Professor Mendelson. As Hassana mentioned, she has a course that she developed. One of her areas of focus, among many things, is that she leads a food security program at the Stimson Center. And Professor Melson, one of the things that you developed is a course on conflict cuisine. Can you talk about that? Talk about that course and basically what it entails and its impact as as a teaching mechanism.
Well, thank you. And thank you to my fellow panelists and you, Mercedes and Hassana, for having me. It's interesting as you were doing the introduction, and I was thinking about why we're talking about food and foreign policy. It's really interesting when Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield came up with the term. What was the Washington Post comment? They said, gunboat diplomacy is out, gumbo diplomacy is in. But what they were really saying is that soft power, of which food is an element of and is a part of public diplomacy, is a very important component of our statecraft. And when I got into this field, sort of late in my career, I had worked on post-conflict and civil military relations. It was really very clear that the kitchen was becoming the new venue of foreign policy. And it's emerged to be a very potent force, not only as a place to eat, and I'm sure Matt Wendell can talk about that in formal settings among heads of states, but also among citizens. And that's what really attracted me to this whole idea of conflict cuisines, because we once had a congressman who then became a senator, Wyche Fowler of Georgia, who said, you can always tell where America is at war by the restaurants that open in Washington. And it was really quite a true statement because growing old here and growing up here, I've been here over 40 years, you could tell first where the Vietnamese restaurants opened after the Vietnam War ended in 1975. We had large influxes of Vietnam refugees. We had Afghan refugees from the 1979 Russian invasion and then a subsequent group. We had Ethiopians. Washington had a very famous and still does have a huge Ethiopian population, the result of the rise of the communist overtaking of the Haile Selassie's regime. I'm sure Mel can talk about that. And then we had an influx at the end of the Cold War of Central Americans from El Salvador, from Guatemala, and Nicaragua because there were civil wars going on. The thing about that is all these areas were areas of conflict. And people came here as a refuge, as people come to America from the earliest days. Even our pilgrims came here to get free from religious oppression. And one of the interesting things is the commonality is food. People use food to break down barriers. When you, as you said, Mercedes, in your travels as a Marine, you use food because it's a way of building trust. And there's lots and lots of research, psychological research, that shows if you break bread with somebody, you're more likely to trust them than if you have a phone call with them. And I think that that's what we see. And that's what people who come from other countries see, is that if they, you learn about other cultures through your palate. You taste food. And before we had TikTok or some of the internets, the only way you could learn about a culture was by tasting the food. And some conjecture that one of the reasons that Nixon did so well in China when he opened the doors is that Americans were familiar with Chinese food in the 60s when this happened. And so that it was easier to accept a culture because they had some familiarity and positive familiarity because of the food with what they tasted. You also asked me, and we can get into this later, the phenomena around food and foreign policy is that beyond the immigrants that have come here and the refugees, we see a phenomena called social gastronomy, which is using food to do good. In our metropolitan area, Jose Andres is probably the most eloquent spokesperson for that, because of the World Central Kitchen effort that he did in disaster relief and then war relief in Ukraine. But actually, social gastronomy started with Brazilians who were working in the favelas and the slums in the poorest parts of Rio and Sao Paulo to get kids jobs with livable wages. Because restaurant work, while it may be hard, does pay a living wage. And if you could train some young kids to learn to cook, you'd be able to then get them into a restaurant and they could stage in a restaurant or they could intern there and eventually get a job. So that's social gastronomy. And the refugee movement in Europe, which started with the terrible war in Syria and the Exodus, which in 2015 reached its peak in Europe, except for now we have Ukrainian refugees as well, was another example of where people who couldn't speak the language used their food as a way of integrating into new societies. And then gastro diplomacy, I go back to what I started, and is that it is a form of public diplomacy. It's citizen public diplomacy, and just the way my colleague Matt does culinary diplomacy, gastro diplomacy is its relative, because culinary diplomacy is practiced between states, but we all are practitioners of our food in sharing it with other people. And I think that's the essence of what conflict cuisine is. Students learn about conflict through restaurateurs. They study the conflicts. They have to write papers. They have to do branding contests. And it becomes a very powerful way to engage young people who've not lived through some of these wars to understand through the eyes of a person who actually was a victim of war what food means to them in building trust in a new homeland.
That's so interesting because I was speaking with Matthew earlier, and we were talking about how the way we look at food as just nutritional, not really realizing that it's more than just nourishment for our bodies to keep us alive. Matthew, what was your comment you stated earlier?
I talked about food as diplomacy, um, even in your personal life and your family life, because you're at home sitting with your family, all sharing a meal, and you have to, as a mother or a father or a member of the family, use diplomacy at that table because some might have had a bad day, some had a good day, the kids are fighting or whatever. But that whole thing brings everyone together. I'm from a family of 9 children, and so we were required to be there at dinner every day, and it was a lot of diplomacy going on around the table.
I
So
bet.
I think that people don't realize how much they're using food in their own personal lives. When you go out with friends or go on a date, you go out to eat. You get to know that person through food.
Absolutely. Now, I want to ask a question to all of our panelists. So we're gonna let's see how fast we can remember. But I want to ask, and we can start with Mel. Um, now, I know all of you have probably traveled extensively. So during your travels, can you talk about your strongest memory where food was involved in some type of mediation, negotiation, or just in general? Mel, we could start with you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be part of this panel. I was telling my daughter that I'm on this Gumbo Diplomacy panel. She said, Dad, you can't even boil a hot dog. How can you be panel? Yeah, there's some truth to that. But I would say that one of the things about travel, one of the things about international affairs, you gotta eat the food. Everybody gotta eat. And so what you find, I've been to nearly 40 countries on the continent as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Part of my time was going out to survey some of the communities in the Romo area about the famine, because they were having an unprecedented famine at the time. This is before We Are the World. And I would go out to these communities, and really, people are literally starving, but they would do a plate of food to eat. You know, you are a special guest, and they will bring some meal, and you're sitting there, and you feel kind of humbled eating it, when people are in such need there. But I've seen many places where I've traveled where a lot of times, you're invited as a special guest. You're an American, or you're funding a project, and people eat all kinds of things. Culture is a very powerful thing. You're moving in a Muslim culture, and they don't eat pork. You're going in another, they're eating raw meat. You go in another community, they're drinking raw camel milk, and you're expected as an honored guest to partake. And so I learned the hard way to eat what you're offered and to drink what you're offered and to be as hospitable as you can. But I can say part of diplomacy, one has to learn about people. You got to learn about culture, and you got to learn how to be adaptable, if at all possible.
Absolutely. I remember in my own travels in the Middle East, it's one of the things culturally they prepared us for, to make sure that we were present and really um, participating in our, I don't know what to call it, our feast, because, culturally it's a very important part of um, making and maintaining those connections. So that's definitely something, for us to think about. What about you, Matthew, in your travels? What do you think is your strongest memory?
Well, I've been been around a lot of important meetings and decisions that were made over food when I worked for the president. But I think that in thinking about this, that the most impressive gathering was I've been to the UN. I work for protocol, so going to the UN and having every UN country member there all together at a reception with food and all in one room. That's pretty remarkable. Uh, to, because they don't all get along, but they're all in that one room sharing food and drink and fellowship. It's very impressive, and I think it's always remarkable when that happens every year. That's their time to be together.
Yeah, I mean, the power of food can bring, people who disagree to a table. What about you, Johanna?
Well, I think in what Mel was talking about of going to a village, even in the most impoverished area, I had worked in Haiti after 1993, and we had development projects there because there had been a military takeover, and then President Aristide had been restored. But even going to the most humble community, I mean, really hours by drive and then walking in, there was always something for the guests. And that really does give you a perspective on what, poverty is about in real time. It's hard, I've eaten many sumptuous meals in many banquets. I've eaten in, these world's best restaurants, and they're spectacular. But I also recognize as an American how privileged I am that I can go into a store and have a variety of food that most people in the world cannot. So I think we, as a country, we are a very generous country in terms of our food assistance, and even that assistance is challenged. So for me, wherever I go, I worked in Turkey for a couple of years with Syrian refugees and Turkish women. What was always nice with them working together is here were two cultures who truly were at loggerheads. They didn't like each other. But when these women with a facilitated conversation realized that the dishes of the Levant were very similar and that they were making the same dishes, they suddenly began to compare. Oh, my grandmother made it this way. Oh, my sister made it this way. And it gave them a point of entry to talk to each other where they had not done so before. So it was building bridges to understanding that made the big difference in these two very different groups politically to come together and see that they were part of the same culture and identity.
That's amazing. And I love that you said that, because a lot of times we don't really realize that the connection is already there, with the similarities and in a lot of cultures, a lot of things that, that we may cook differently, but the connection is already there. And it definitely opens a gateway, to more discussions. Now, Matthew, I wanted to ask you, there's a term that we've heard that you've said before that's called cheeseburger diplomacy. Can you talk about that?
Mhm. Sure. Well, I was the personal cook for the president at his ranch in Camp David, and both places they love cheeseburgers, and so we often, most often, have cheeseburgers for lunch when we had a world leader visiting, which kind of seems, lowbrow, but actually, um, they kind of expected it. They would come to a ranch in Texas and have a simple cheeseburger and just be able to enjoy it. And so when the president was meeting with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at the White House one time, they served cheeseburgers for lunch. And a Associated Press reporter in Japan wrote an article about how they bonded over a simple cheeseburger, an American cheeseburger, and that how Prime Minister Abe was so um, impressed that that simple act by the president sharing his American tradition just helped break the ice between them. And it was just such a simple meal, but we served them all the time, and they were quite popular.
Well, they are definitely not McDonald's cheeseburgers. And I'm sure that they were good. I mean, something simple as a cheeseburger. I mean, I think that's really amazing.
Mhm.
Thank you, Matthew. Mel, I
Sure.
wanted to ask you, um, how does the concept of breaking bread and gumbo diplomacy create a unique space for building trust and rapport in international business relations? I know this is kind of your wheelhouse. And as Hassana said, you have been to many, many places we've probably never heard. But how can it influence long-term relationships for successful ventures in business?
Well, I always like to think about the need to eat. I mean, I don't care who you are. If you're a human being, you got to find some way to eat. And I've always felt that we should also be concerned about how people eat. That should be our top concern. Now, personally, I advocate that U.S. policy should aim at. They say, give a man a fish, he'll eat today, and if you teach him how to fish, he'll eat for the rest of his life. And so I like to see us focus on, food producing activities. For instance, I did a lot of work in refugee camps in Somalia, and uh, at one point, I can't. We were bringing food, we were bringing medicine, we were bringing food to the people who were in need of food. And refugees are increasing around the world. But one time I decided to go down and buy a bunch of hoes and axes and vegetables seeds, and I took them up to the refugee camp and distributed them. I can tell you that I'm sure they built a statue with my name because of that. So you teach a man to fish, sure, he can eat for the rest of his life as opposed to just fishing. I'm also an advocate for when I think about U.S. policy toward Africa, we're pushing for trade with Africa. We want to increase our Africa like China and Russia and other countries. But we also should be looking at what we're trading. I was shocked when I went to South Africa and some other countries, and you see Pizza Hut all over the place and Kentucky Fried Chicken. Gee whiz, we should be trading agricultural products We should be trading technology. We should helping people to eat, but we should also be trying to help them to eat healthy, as opposed to just throwing our garbage on, people in other countries. So when I think about this discussion about gumbo diplomacy, I'm also thinking about how we go about it to improve the quality of lives of people in other parts of the world.
Well, I
Now,
just
Mel,
wanted to ask, I was just going to ask Mel a question though, because your point is very important. But with climate change, even when you give people the tools to work, the biggest challenge is that the land that they once worked on is no longer fertile. I mean, that's why all these poor people from Central America are walking their way up because of the drought. There is no way you can farm on land that once 30, 40 years ago was arable. And I think that's where we all who are concerned about food need to be considering what are the climate implications when we do use food as a tool of diplomacy. So I don't know. You were a Peace Corps volunteer, and I see a chef shaking his head because he probably is into waste reduction, but it bothers me tremendously as someone who studies food security.
Yeah, I think you're making great points. And this climate change, I'm thinking about Eastern Libya right now. And of course, they had unprecedented flooding and the dams have broken, and it's like 20,000 people have died last week. I mean, last week, 20,000 people, and it's climate change, at the core of this. And so if we're going to make the world a sustainable place for our children and in the future, clearly we got to be thinking about how people are going to live their lives, how people are going to eat, how people are going to become sustainable on in the areas that they are. But we're seeing all over the place where climate change is dramatically altering how people can survive. I think you're right on point.
absolutely. And I want to come back to the climate change piece here in just a moment. But Mel, you mentioned something earlier about, I wrote it down, about paying attention to what we import, right? Um, and I wanted to ask you, I know oftentimes, when something happens, a disaster happens, and, a lot of countries come together and they want to send relief, but not necessarily really paying attention to what's being sent or just in general business. Why do you think it's important for us as we talk about the use of food to establish connections and to maintain connections? Why is it important for us to pay attention to what we're sending, what we're exporting, what we're importing?
Well, if you look at a place like Bahamas, which is close by, when I first went to Bahamas, the people were basically getting their fish every day because they got water everywhere. They were vegetables in in their backyards, living very healthy lives. So what happened? Americans come in and they don't want these people working sustainable agriculture. They want them working in the casinos and the hotels and the tourist industry. And so we'll bring you your food. Don't worry about producing your food. We're going to bring food, but you got to work in the industry. Well, what happened is obesity, hypertension, diabetes zoomed because they're eating, fried foods. They're eating processed food. They're eating food that certainly goes against the grain. And so, we got to be, not only we got to be doing well, we got to be doing good. And we should be encouraging American technology to help people live better lives. But what would I see often, we're pushing, we want the numbers to grow. We want to talk about $55 billion we're doing trade in Africa, but without looking at what is the context of that trade. Are we trading, technology to help people to grow food and to live better lives? Are we trading processed food or cigarettes or things that are going to make people unhealthy? And I think we have to do a better job at looking at it, especially for the next generation coming up. We got to do a better job. And not only are we encouraging trade, but we want great trade from America to the rest of the world.
Absolutely, because it does make a difference, and it has a tangible impact as well. Um, Matthew, now you sort of just breezed over the piece of talking about being the chef for the Bush family, but you worked as the head chef for former President George W. Bush and his family from 2001 to 2007. But you actually have no formal training, right?
Right.
Now, how did you pull that off?
Um, well, like I said, from a large family, a small farming community in Texas. My mother made sure that all her children knew how to cook. Um, that give a man a fish or teaching him a fish, because she said, if you know how to cook, you'll always find a job and you never go hungry. And with that crowded of a house, she was cooking every day, and it just happened to be that that was my time alone with her in the kitchen. So that was just a good byproduct of it. But I was interested in food always. I worked in restaurants in high school and worked in catering and restaurants and all through college and some even after. I then got a job with the government in Texas. I was an investigator of all things with the state veterinary board. And then after many years, I decided that there had to be something else out there. I wasn't feeling fulfilled. I was living in Austin, and I just decided to quit my job. I told myself I'd give myself a year, kept a good day, bad day calendar. And if bad days added up more at the end of the year, I would quit my job. And of course they did. So I leaned back on my food life and became a cater waiter around town in Austin, and just happened to get sent to the governor's inauguration, Governor Bush at the time. And it just went on from there. I formed my own catering and events company. And so I totally embraced the food life. And he ended up asking me if I would come take care of his family in Washington. So here I am.
And just an exceptional chef. Thank you so much, Wendell. Now, I wanted to just piggyback on something that you said. You talked about how your life in food really started with your family.
Mhm.
So food diplomacy is also generational, um, because that's where it starts. The fact that you were able to build a career off of time spent in the kitchen with your mom and your family members, I think it's amazing. So sometimes even those seeds are planted, even something like this are planted very early on. And it's rare that people can still tap into that and really make a life and a career that actually has a positive impact on society. So that is absolutely amazing.
It's a Cinderella story, I guess.
And we love Cinderella stories. um Matthew, can you briefly tell us about the history of the Blair House and its function?
Sure. The Blair House was built in 1824 um, for the first Surgeon General of the Army. Uh, and it's right across the street from the White House, and it serves as the president's guest house. So the original house was built in 1824. Then they built a house next door for their daughter, who married a cousin of Robert E. Lee. It's called the Lee House. And then in the Nixon administration, they added two more townhouses to the Blair House. So it's now a total of four townhouses, 70,000 square feet. It's used for the president's guest. It was, I believe the story goes, it was first acquired because of what's his name? British Minister. Anyway, he was coming, Winston Churchill. He would come to the White House and stay for a long time during the war. And he was known for sometimes drinking too much and carousing around at night, sometimes not wearing anything or a nightshirt. And so Ms. Roosevelt decided, she said, I've had enough. You must find him someplace else to stay. So then is born the Blair House. So ever since the government bought the house in 1942 and turned it into the president's guest house, it's used for visiting heads of state invited by the president to stay, for them and the delegation. We fly their flag when they're here. We consider this their residence when they're in town. They're free to use the entire house for just about whatever they want. And my job is and our job, the staff, is to make the leader and his delegation feel totally comfortable, at home, at ease, have privacy, feel safe, all those things, so that they can have productive meetings with the president, vice president, Congress. That's our main mission. It also serves as a gathering place for the diplomatic corps, all the foreign ambassadors in Washington. So we often have briefings, we have events for them and their families sometimes. So all those events, there's food served. And so every country's ambassador in the world comes here together, and they visit, they get to know each other. And we constantly have an influx of new ambassadors being credentialed. So they get to meet all their counterparts. So this Blair House is one of America's greatest soft diplomatic tools.
And I love that, because even today it says on the website that the Blair House is, a significant foreign policy tool.
Mhm.
So, I mean, the importance of it is still there.
We call
John?
we call it diplomacy through hospitality.
Mhm.
Awesome. I love that. Johanna, can you talk about what would you say are some timeless principles from history of culinary diplomacy that you can think of that can really guide the future of Gumbo Diplomacy? For example, just paving the way for more meaningful and impactful exchanges on a global stage.
Well, there are two theories of culinary diplomacy which go back to ancient times. It's the oldest form of nonverbal communication. I mean, you are using food as a language, and that's really important. It's a way of communicating. And, this goes back to the Romans, where they had special ways to communicate with gods through feasts and meals. It also is a language on its own, and linguists have studied food as communication as a theory, because every culture has its own language in the order it serves food. So, for example, we end our meals with a cup of coffee. That's a punctuation mark. When the coffee is served, the meal is over. I'm sure Matt knows that in his own service of hospitality. But I'm sure in African cultures, there's a different meal ending. We eat dessert. In Asian culture, dessert is separate. It's not a course. I mean, you don't eat sweets. There's not even a simple character in Chinese for sweet. You have to have a combination of characters. So it's a language. So these two things, this non-logocentric communication or nonverbal communication, is a theory. And then the other one is the ability to communicate without, with the order or the identity.
That's amazing. I said that you said it's a language.
It is a language.
And food is universal. I mean, there are all kinds of languages. Most people associate, love languages and all those other things, but food really is that unspoken thing that can really bring people together. And I think that that's really, really important. I know where I'm from, when we bring a cup of tea, that's how we know the meal is over. And it's time to leave the table. Mel, you could probably share some stories, from your travels concerning that.
Well, I will think about Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who I know very well. And Ambassador Greenfield is from Louisiana, which is synonymous with food, you know. And you go down there and they're roasting alligators and doing all kinds of things with food. I would think as a diplomat, she would be a very difficult person to deal with if she got you to her house and had the gumbo on display. I would suspect, I don't care if you want to get rid of nuclear weapons, she could get it done over some gumbo. I would just think that, because I'm thinking back at diplomats that I have encountered over the years, and the ones who really had everything going their way is the one who could take you to their house for a dinner or a lunch or something. I went, Jessica Davis-Barr, who is now the U.S. ambassador to Cote d'Ivoire, was at the AU mission in Ethiopia. I'm really close to her and her family. In fact, her and her husband, they have five sons. But I introduced them in my office. You know, they met in my office. And so I always tease them. I said, you got 5 boys, name one of them after me. But they hosted me in Addis Ababa with their, for lunch. And she was busy doing her thing, but she, came home and had the dinner, the lunch all organized. Her sons were all there. And over a 2-hour lunch, we just got so many things done. And you can't say no to a diplomat who can cook. You just can't say no. I don't care what they're asking or what they're negotiating for their country. I would think it's probably the most effective tool you can have in diplomacy is to be able to host somebody over food.
Absolutely. I mean, that personal connection. So, on top of sharing a meal, right? And, cooking it yourself and having that personal connection, that personal outreach with a person, I think is so meaningful, and it just makes a world of difference. It really, really does.
It kind of says, I care enough about you, or to serve you my food, um, or I love you because I give you food. And, we've used it forever. If someone is sick or someone dies, what's the first thing you do? You take food to their house. You take food, you have a meal after the service. So it does many things. It's healing as
Mhm.
well.
Absolutely.
It's all tied to rituals.
Can you share a little bit more about that, Johanna?
And I see your dean is on, but when I was in Turkey, I met a group of women who were teaching me how to make special food for funerals. They made a stuffed, it wasn't a cabbage, it was kale leaf, and they were stuffing it with meat, and they said that this was taken when people were in a wake. And they
Mm.
ate this because you were sitting so long, and it had other effects as well. But they were very busy making these in teacups and molding them. And, I was recently at a conference on rituals and food, and it's not the only food that is eaten. There are rituals for when people are born, there are rituals when people would die, and each culture has their own way of celebrating them. And food is always part of that celebration, no matter how happy or sad the event. It's associated with food.
Yes, absolutely. And it's amazing. Just food is just everywhere. I mean, it's a part of every single thing.
Well,
I mean, every part of our lives. And I to know that it can also be used as a tool in diplomacy to agree or to disagree, you know, makes a difference. But mostly we want people to agree. I wanted to ask Dean Ozaderm about, you know, we look at the news and there's just so much going on in the world, climate change, um, you know, conflicts that are new, conflicts that are old. But Dino Zidrum, in your experience and your studies and travels, you know, between Bosnia and Afghanistan and several other places, I wanted to ask you about the importance of food in these type of environments, conflict, you know, basically war affected countries, and how food is used as a connector and a divider
Mhm.
in these circumstances.
Thank you, Mercedes, and greetings to you all, and apologies for being late as part of Peace Week. I'm expected to attend a number of events, and I'm just moving from one to another. And but I'm so pleased that I finally managed to join this panel. And I must say, the attendees, the number of attendees, I'm not surprised that there are so many people interested in this subject, but I'm really pleased to see that, you know, indicating that this is a very important part of peace building that we should consider. And what I just heard over the last 5 minutes from my fellow panelists, I totally agree with them about the importance of Gumbo diplomacy and the significance of food in our cultures, in our cultural heritage, and simply because of that, as a professor of peace and conflict studies over the last 25 years in all sorts of different war-affected countries in different parts of the world, one common thematic area that, you know, I always notice is the significance of food and 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 what role that plays in those societies. And I totally agree with Joanna that there is no single ritual that wouldn't involve food, right? There's always that aspect of food. So it's a great connector. So especially in after civil wars, in the environments of divided societies, and the divisions may be to do with faith or ethnicity or whatever reasons. Obviously, those wars really magnify those differences and deepen them, creating deep cleavages of differences. And in fact, that's what the war does, like killing not only people, but also it kills the truth, but also it kills the trust. And within that, you end up with an environment that with lots of high level of skepticism and suspicion and resentment and certain level of hate, all this you know, sense of negative feelings, right? So in an environment like that, for peace builders, one of the probably most effective tools that they're able to use is creating connections. And that connection, as mentioned earlier, the power of food as a language, as a kind of like a way of presenting, is the symbolism of it, what that means. And so you don't, in fact, sometimes need to say even much. By, you know, you can just, you know, create that environment of eating together. And another thing, in divided societies, it is used in wide range of ways, and I've seen you know, many examples of that. But at the same time, though, I really want to kind of point out that there is a kind of like the level of competition over food and cultural heritage in such areas, and I think we should be prepared for that too. So in a divided society, say like Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was part of Yugoslavia, right? So before the war in mid-1990s, they would have probably referred their food as Yugoslavian food. It was, you know, it was Bosnian food. But because of the civil war and the three parties, Serbs, Croats, and Bosniak Muslims, at the end of the war, they start to describe their food as Croatian food, Serbian food, and the Bosniak food, right? So this whole labeling through nationalism, for food is a common practice too. So it's a kind of like a space where the appropriation takes place, and that becomes very much like the part of that nationalist policies, like and really entrenching the particular area. Like it's all about like creating a new future by reinterpreting the past. And in that, the role of food is just so important for societies, and that is one of the areas. And interestingly enough, earlier on, Joanna mentioned about me being from Turkey originally, and yes, and like Turkish coffee, for example,
Oh, yes.
right? And so that's a great connector. In Turkey, we use coffee not just only at the end of the meal, but any time of the day. But coffee is really it's not just drinking, but it all starts when you start to make coffee.
Right.
Traditionally, when you make coffee, people sit around it. That kind of ritual of making it slowly and then kind of observing that coffee is being brewed and all the aromas coming out of it and people enjoying it. You start the connection even, during the process. But the coffee drinking itself, there's an etiquette with that. You cannot drink coffee by being just quiet. The expectation is that when you drink coffee, you need to have a conversation, and preferably meaningful conversation. I mean, okay, people do gossip over coffee too, but coffee is a kind of a vehicle, a kind of a place, right? It's a tool for that. But I'm just going to go back to my point around being a divider. Not quite divider, but Turkish coffee has many interpretations in that geography. So, for example, if you go to Greece, it's no longer Turkish coffee, it's Greek coffee. And never make that mistake of asking for Turkish coffee in Greece, because they will say this is Greek coffee. And to be honest, I don't mind, I don't care. Let's enjoy a nice cup of coffee. That's my kind of like the starting point here. But what I'm saying is that kind of like the appropriation really does take place. And also with food, this whole branding with nationalism, right?
Gastro-nationalism.
Yes, like I'm, even in my like last 5 minutes, I'm talking about Turkish food, Turkish coffee, right? So, well, ultimately, Turkish cuisine is the end product of many centuries of different civilizations, different communities. I mean, you have Armenians, you have Greeks, you have Jews. Those all different communities lived in that geography, and collectively they created as what we know as Turkish food, right? So I think when we are branding the food, we need to be quite careful. Let's not go into the trap of this kind of like the food nationalism. That can be quite a divisive space. So I think, in short, what I'm saying is that we all recognize the importance of food in diplomacy, and let's make sure that we use it for that purpose. But let's be also aware that there might be some people, some interest groups want to use that as a divider too, right? So I think that's the point I want to share with you.
Well, we also have the example of borscht and what's happened in the Ukraine war, where the nation of Ukraine applied for emergency expedited protection of borscht as a Ukrainian dish and got it from UNESCO over the Russians, and that created a tremendous additional rivalry. But then it was a reflection of how food was homogenized during the Soviet period, so that recipes from all these different countries that became part of what we knew as the Soviet Union were listed all together in one big cookbook that Mikoyan put together in the 30s with Stalin. So that's what people learned to cook. And now food nationalism is a very important point in these post-Soviet countries. And to the extent that Ukraine got protection of borscht in the middle of the war, is an example of how that works.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Now, Dean Ozadam, I know you talked about Turkish coffee, and I just have to ask this question. So, for people that don't know, can you tell us, very quickly, um, the process of making Turkish coffee? Because it's not just you pour water in a cup and then that's it. There's a really intricate process with making Turkish coffee and serving and receiving it.
I would be more than happy to do that, but if you want to actually see how it's made, there are some videos for that, including mine. I made Turkish coffee for my students during the pandemic, just sort of like generate a different type of feeling. And so search for that video. It's hilarious, like me making Turkish coffee in the kitchen. And but the point is here, I mean, ironically, we don't grow coffee in Turkey.
Oh, it comes from Yemen.
So it comes from Yemen. It's a certain type of coffee, but I think it's called Turkish coffee because it is kind of processed in a certain way. It needs to be processed twice in order to get that sort of like really fine, the granular kind of substance. But making coffee itself, you have this special uh, cup, metal, the
Savash.
yes, and it is all about your personal skills. Now, there are lots of interpretations of this, like how much water for how much coffee, and how much sugar you are supposed to put. People are very serious about that, right? So my formula would be for each cup, I would put 1 teaspoonful of coffee. For my mother, that was just ridiculous. It was far too weak. So if you want a real Turkish coffee, it had to be 1.5 at least, right? So I cannot describe the exact amount. It all depends. I drink my coffee, Turkish coffee, without sugar, but some people like it sweet, and it all depends. But the point is that don't rush it. Get the coffee really kind of like integrated with water, and take time with the low heat, and slowly you need to stir it. And probably each time you stir, there are thoughts of love should go through your mind, because you are transferring your passion and love in that coffee, because you're about to share it with the most special person for you, right? And you are going to have a good conversation over that coffee. And it doesn't stop there. Once you have that coffee, then you can do a little bit fortune telling, right? The coffee cup reading is a national sport in Turkey, right? And there are even people doing this professionally, interestingly enough. So you can actually enjoy the coffee, and after that, get some ideas about what might be happening, whether I would say 3 days or 3 months. They always start the sentence like that. This will happen to you. It might happen in 3 days or 3 months, but, right? So that kind of like reading the future is also part of that whole ritual.
And I love that ritual. I'm definitely gonna be at your door to have a reading for sure. Now, I want to pose this question to Johanna. Um, obviously, this is our Carter School Peace Week. We do this twice a year in the fall and the spring, and we're always, thinking of things that we can bring to the forefront, and this was one of them. So, regarding this particular topic, as an educational institution and other organizations, how can we incorporate food and culinary diplomacy into our programs that can nurture a greater sense of cultural appreciation and global citizenship?
Well, I mean, I think having courses dedicated to the connection between food and soft power in a school of international studies is very important. And that's one way in an academic sense. But I think, I'm at American University, and we say what's local is global. We're in a community which we're very lucky to have a diversity of citizens from all over the world. We have people from international organizations that live here. We have diplomatic cook-offs that have taken place. And I think more of those things would be beneficial to students. And I'm going to have to leave in a minute or two, but I'm sure the dean knows about the Turkish coffee lady in Alexandria who makes her own coffee. She comes to my class often to make her coffee. But the point is that there are lots of ways to get students engaged in a way which is powerful. But also, and I'm sure Mel has a comment about this, is that food diplomacy is also about our food security. And we are, as a country, we're the largest donors to the World Food Program at the United Nations. And I think people have to understand the international geography of food diplomacy beyond just the culinary and gastro areas as to how the world gets access to food, because we're not meeting our goals this week. We're halfway through the Sustainable Development Goals, and food is really falling short. And that's because of a COVID pandemic, because of conflicts, and also just because of the climate changing. So there is plenty of room to educate people about this. And I'm sure you'll find many ways, and we should do more programs to, be an educator with all sorts of people. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave in a minute, but I want to thank everybody, and it's been so great to participate. I have to teach today, but I will hopefully connect with all of you in the future. So thank you.
you, Johanna. Thank you. Mel, well, she put you
Put you on the spot. I'm not going to get off till you answer me, but
on first, so you can answer that.
Well, there's a couple things I want to say. One, I think you ought to invite us to the campus to have an international food festival featuring the best gumbo, and then we should have this people to people with your students at the Carter Center would be a good idea. I also wanted to say that having spent many years in Ethiopia, we're talking about coffee now. Come on, we would negotiate who got the best coffee in the world. But they have such a process. The coffee thing is a ritual, from everything from the beans until they serve it. Then they got this thing about you can't have 1 cup of coffee, you got to have 2 cups. If you have 2 cups, you got to have a third. If you have 3 cups, you got to have a 4th cup. By the time you get home, you can't sleep for 3 days because of the caffeine. But and they do the same thing with every element of food. I mean, food is, you'll find the people in the best thing you can do is accept somebody's invitation to their house so that they can feed you. And I don't care what the quality of the furniture, the size of the house, people. Another thing I wanted to say also, Americans think we got the best food, and America's food is honestly, it's a combination of all of us. But a lot of our food actually comes from far reaches of the world, the rice culture, the bean culture. We ought to also examine where does American food really come from. We're thinking that everything is about a hot dog or a hamburger, which also came from Germany or some other places. But it seemed to me that we ought to be examining where our food really comes from and the contributions of humanity in producing food.
Awesome. Thank you, Mel. Matthew, I wanted to pose this question to you, and Dean Ozodom and Mel, you all can answer as well. Matthew, so for aspiring chefs, diplomats, and individuals interested in using food as a means for building bridges, what advice would you give them on how they can use food to build those bridges and influence positive change?
Are these people going to cook the food, or maybe? Maybe. I would say start with something simple. I mean, it doesn't have to be elaborate. People don't, people come to your house or your event not to necessarily eat the food, but to see you and spend time with you. So if, say, we were at the ranch and Vladimir Putin came for a visit, uh, they sat down at a table, ate their food together. I cooked his breakfast the next morning, took it to him, served him. It's just that kind of, you've got to, food is caring. So you need to have the right intent when you serve the food, or the right, think about what you're preparing or serving. Is it going to insult that person? Are they allergic to it? You got to do your research and find out what they dislike and like. And also, I would just start out simple with a simple dish shows something. Cookies show that you care enough to serve cookies.
Yeah, the simple the simple gestures that I think
Yeah.
have the most meaning. Yeah, absolutely. We're going, oh, I think let me unmute Dino Lazadar. Okay.
I just want to add, I mean, obviously, whether it's possible to do this between Biden and Putin, but, at different levels, I think it would be great to actually get people cooking together as part of that process, because presenting food is one thing, but actually preparing food together is a very effective way of building bridges, right? Because especially if they are coming from cultures, they might not know anything about their culture, each other's cultures, or they are very familiar. I guess what happens is that, peace building is all about dialogue, is all about connection, is all about empathy, is all about being able to understand each other. What you want to create is a kind of a condition of sharing and dialogue and conversation. And those who cook regularly would know this so well. While you cook, you talk, right? And especially when there are people in the kitchen, just like, so cooking together itself could also be a very good way of building bridges for peace building.
For instance, I was cooking at the ranch one time out at the barbecue pit. We were having smoked beef tenderloin, and Chancellor Angela Merkel was visiting. She was out on a walk with the president, Mrs. Bush, and she came up to the barbecue pit and started a conversation about, I love to grill. How are you doing your steak or your beef, and what seasonings are you using? All that dialogue, and I think that helps kind of set the tone and relaxes them more.
Yep.
Awesome. So we have a few questions from the audience. I am going to hand off to Hassana to share some of these questions for our panelists.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. There's a question. Okay, Matthew, this question is for you. It says, one person, they want to, did you feel pressure to incorporate foods that were familiar to some of the foreign dignitaries' palates, or did you employ the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, when you prepared meals?
We actually, good question. We always, Mrs. Bush felt strongly about sharing our culture with the leader that visited. And so we would get the dietary restrictions, of course, from them to make sure we weren't cooking anything they were allergic to or didn't like. But she always wanted to show the best of America, Texas, since we were in Texas at a ranch, and just have that simple ranch food. and we didn't have anything fussy. I actually, when I started working for them, and she asked me to make something, I said, Ms. Bush, if you want all these intricate little desserts, that's not me. You got the wrong person. I make them, when I make a pie, I use my thumbs and it shows. Everything's not perfect because my mother taught me, if you make it too perfect, they'll think you bought it. So you want it to be homemade and not too perfect.
Actually, I have a question, a follow-up question for you, Matthew. Just under my research about your background, my question is like, why was the Bush's home at Prairie Ranch Chapel like? Well, why do you think it was like the perfect place to have these diplomatic meetings?
Well, it was secluded. It was very casual. It was their home, and who doesn't want to be invited to someone's home? That's an icebreaker right there. Come to my home, stay. We'll feed you. We'll drive around the ranch. We'll, sit on the back porch, watch the sunset. And they were, being Texans, they were very welcoming. Not that other states are not, but so it worked perfectly for that sort of things. And you could see it with other presidents in their ranches or their homes would always invite leaders. The Reagans, they had many people out to their ranch.
Okay, all right. So we have another question here. This might be for everyone or anyone who wants to take it. How can we ensure that gumbo diplomacy and culinary diplomacy remain inclusive and representative of diverse cultures without being overly influenced by commercial interest or global food trends? Maybe that's a question for you, Mel. I don't know.
I would just say that the Biden administration has made a strong push to improve diversity in the U.S. government, and we see it in the State Department, Vice President Kamala Harris, and across the board. But also, you recognize that this diversity of that you're bringing to bear also brings diversity of interest and diversity of food, and all of that. So I think the best thing for America is to show that we are a diverse culture, that all of us somehow can get along, and we get along one way or another. But I think that this is what we need to be selling to countries around the world, that we're a melting pot, as opposed to what some would argue the reality of it. We're but food is the tool that actually bring us together, because everybody has got to eat. And you got to be, the diplomats, you got to be careful about what you're serving people, but people generally are happy to be sitting around the table to learn more about another culture. And I think this could be the strongest suit for the United States as we pursue a global diplomacy.
Awesome, great. Mercedes, there seems to be like 3 more questions, but I'm looking at our time. Maybe we can just have time for one more.
Sure.
And I'll pick it. I like it. This question, again, anonymous. All right. So this question says, it's to all panelists. What is your most memorable diplomatic experience involving food? So that's open for all of you all to kind of answer, and then we'll end it there. I'm sorry if we didn't get to anyone's question.
I would say mine, like I said it before, the most impressive is still all the UN, United Nations member countries coming together in one room for one big reception, and they're all there together sharing food and drink and camaraderie.
One thing that strikes me, Ethiopia, they eat from one big basket. They call it a meso, and they'll have the chicken right here and the vegetables, 7 different entities. Then they have the pepper also there. They call it berbere, and this is the hottest pepper you ever want to see. One time, I had an American military attaché was at his house, and he had the Ethiopian. He was doing the job, so he had the Ethiopian set up their base off their food. They had a bunch of us there. So you basically grab it with one hand. You don't eat with two hands. You eat with one hand because the other hand you do your business with. So you eat with your right hand. So he takes it. You're supposed to just tap the pepper as you get your food. You tap the pepper, add a little spice. He thought the pepper was one dish, and he grabbed a whole handful of pepper and he ate it. Everybody looked at him like, "Wow, can you believe he did that?" And you can actually see the steam coming out of his ears. And he's trying to be diplomatic, but I'm never gonna ever forget that episode.
That's such a great story, Mel. I'm sure he never forgot it either. Al?
Oh, well, I don't spend much time with presidents, prime ministers, and serve them food. So my anecdote will be different. But I think that was in Sierra Leone. It was with the reintegration of child soldiers and ex-combatants. And we were in the northeastern part of the country. And this particular initiative was very sensitive because large number of young men and women were going back to their communities, and there was a high level of tension amongst people because the kind of like the nature of the conflict and some of the things that those combatants, especially child soldiers, were to do against their communities. You know, there was a fear, resentment, and all sorts of mixture of negative feelings. And so we were there like 2 days before this arrival took place, and we were talking to community and everything. And men were a little bit more kind of like anxious than women. The women seemed kind of like all at ease, you know, like thinking, well, you know, this is going to be fine and everything. And I was kind of wondering what's going on here, right? Is there something that going to happen that I don't know, you know? And I wish I'd known. I mean, kind of like, because women were confident, the fact that they could prepare collectively in the village this big feast, right? And really good food. So for the arrival of people and the villagers. And so you could see the kind of like the eyes be kind of like shying away. The body language was just so kind of like timid, like kind of reserved. And then we were asked to sit under the trees and the food started to arrive. Oh my God, in like half an hour, this was the kind of Gumbo diplomacy in big making. You could see people are kind of chatting and everything. You know, this whole thing about like those, you know, young men and women coming back to their communities, it was no longer kind of an issue. Well, I'm sure back of their mind, that was still an issue, but they were giving the peace a chance, and they were using food for that. And I've come across many examples of that, but that particular one really affected me because just kind of seeing that happening in front of my eyes, and the transformation of that community, you know, around food, eating together. That was really impressive.
And I mean, just, today we've explored uh, the power of food and in all these uh, different aspects, different parts of our lives. And the food is just such a powerful tool. And I just want to get one final thought. We have about 4 minutes left from everyone. Just one final thought. Um, as we look at the world today, it's very divided by politics and different ideologies. And I'm wondering, how can we harness the unifying force of food to break down barriers, build lasting friendships, and create a global table where diplomacy transcends borders and flavors, just bringing us closer together? We could start with Mel.
Well,
Kind
when
of,
I think about this, I really think about global food security. And I think that the next generation coming up, my daughter is part of that. She's a foreign service officer now at USAID. You're going to have to deal with the question of how we eat. This is going to be the number one question, and it's connected directly to climate change and some of these other things. So I think for your students and for the future of the young people, this is going to be the number one question that's going to be in their life, is the security of people to eat, to drink water, to have access to health care. This is the future of the world is tied into this very question. So while we're talking about gumbo diplomacy and what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, it's a much bigger question on the table for the future of the next generation. So thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to some real, this is the thought, but we want to have some food for the belly also the next time. So gumbo diplomacy, let's make it real.
Absolutely.
No, thank you.
Matthew?
I totally agree with Mel. The food security, one of the first things in conflicts that they cut off is the food supply. So, Ukraine, they were having trouble getting their food supply in. And, that's kind of the heartbeat of the human existence. It sustains you, and it builds bridges, and it does all these things. But the security of the food plays a major role.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Alp?
Excellent points. And just in one sentence, whether it's food security or gumbo diplomacy, I think what I'm taking from this conversation is that, at a place like the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, we need to pay a particular attention on this topic. And I think this can be such an exciting way of really want to understand the conflict, but also how to build peace, right? And so that's my lesson learned from this conversation, and I want to do something about that. So thank you all for sharing your amazing experiences and reflections. I much appreciate it and learned so much from all of you.
Thank you, Dean Ozodom. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Hassana. Thank you for being a part of this amazing panel. We learned a lot today. And I hope that those that attended received some food for thought. And, we can, just ways of how we can do this, how we can use food in a different way to make the world a better place, to have a more positive impact. So thank you all so much for joining us. Dean Ozodom, I'm going to give you the very last word. For those of you that may not know, Peace Week was birthed out of the Dean's vision to just take International Day beyond just a day. So as you know, we do Peace Week twice a year, in the fall and in the spring. And this was birthed out of his idea. So Alp, I will give you the last word.
Look, you're very kind, but I think everybody wants to go and eat something. We talk about food so much that I'm personally hungry now. And but I think yes, as Mercedes just shared, we organize Peace Week twice a year, and today's Thursday. There's still one more day left in this fall 23 Peace Week. We do this to reach out to different communities, different constituencies, different people in our public. It's beyond the school. So please spread the word and let others know that there's something called Peace Week here at the Carter School, so that they can really be part of these conversations on peace and conflict resolution in different ways. And but one final thought, Mercedes. I think Gumbo Diplomacy should be a permanent feature of Peace Week. I think we should continue this dialogue through our Peace Weeks, and I think that would be really great.
Awesome. Let's do it. Thank you, Dean Ozodom. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Matthew. And we were also grateful to have Professor Johanna Mendelson Foreman with us. So we're not going to hold you any longer. Enjoy your day, get some food, and we will see you soon. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.